Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us for Don't Waste Your Content, Innovative Ways to Increase Online Engagement. My name is Lisa Liu, and I'm the Web and Communication Manager for What Works in Youth HIV. And this webinar is being recorded, and you can get a copy of the slides and the recording and other materials on our website within a week of this webinar. So we wanted to have people share their ideas of what they're hoping to gain today and learn from today's webinar. So if you click on the link in the chat box, you can share what you hope to learn. This is a public board, so when you click on the link, you'll see a question there, and if you have an answer to the question, you can press a green plus sign, and that will bring up a little Post-it note, and you can type an answer right there on the Post-it note. And then you'll be able to see other people's Post-it notes that they're adding, and if you see one that you like, you can go ahead to the right-hand corner of that note and press the +1 or thumbs up button to indicate that, that you like that idea. So I see one or two coming in, so we'll just leave that up if you want to add your ideas to that board, and then we'll loop back to this in just a few minutes, just so we can get a sense for what you're all hoping to gain today from the webinar. So first I'd like to do some housekeeping. You'll have control over the size of the slides you see today. So if you see the example of the Zoom box in the right-hand corner, you can use the WebEx interface in the upper right-hand corner of your screen to go from full screen or to other size views. So if there are things that are hard to see, please adjust your view as needed. And all attendees are in listen-only mode, so if you have a technical issue or question, please use the chat box at the lower right of your screen to chat with the host. Make sure you select host from the drop-down box as you see as an example on the screen. You can also send questions to whatworksinyouthhiv@jsi.com. So the audio is being shared via your computer speakers and headset. If you can't hear the audio, which means you can't hear me right now, but you can read what's on the screen, make sure your computer audio is turned on. If you're still having problems, please use the call-in number that you see on the screen. It's 1-866-469-3239, and the access code is 625-812-337. So for those of you that are not familiar with our project, What Works in Youth HIV is operated by JSI Research and Training. We are an international public health organization, and we're funded for this project through a cooperative agreement with the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Adolescent Health, with funding from the Secretary's Minority AIDS Initiative Fund. We partner with 3Spot, a digital agency based in Washington, D.C., and the 3Spot team provides digital strategy and creative direction for What Works, and two of them are my co-presenters today. So I'd like to introduce you to Chris Montwell. He's the creative mastermind behind What Works, and specifically he oversees the design and user experience of the What Works in Youth HIV website. And Michael Sanders provides strategic input on the What Works social media strategy, including much of what we'll be discussing today about quizzes and other ways to engage people online. So to learn more about our project, please visit whatworksinyouthhiv.org. And to summarize what we do, our goal is to improve the health and well-being of America's adolescents by providing practical and innovative website content that empowers youth-serving providers to meet the needs of youth at highest risk for HIV. The strategies that we use include supporting and promoting interventions to better integrate HIV prevention focused on youth, because really there is a lot of information out there for adults, and we definitely need more strategies focused on youth. That is one of the main goals of our project and of the website. We also promote evidence-based practices in the programs and connect with training and technical system opportunities like today's webinar. So I'm just going to jump back over to the idea board before we look at the objectives and see that a number of people, 6 people voted for how to get youth engaged when it comes to health, specifically the importance of getting tested, and how to get community knowledge about how public health is involved in community health. So I think these are some we'll definitely have some ways to answer these questions and challenges that you've brought to us today, and we hope that you'll think so too. So just to go over some specific objectives for today, we hope that by the end of today you'll be able to summarize the latest statistics for social media use among adolescents, to identify the steps for creating a social media advertising campaign, to describe the process for creating quizzes to engage audiences on social media, and understand how social media can be used to engage an audience. And we really want to share our successes with using quizzes that we found as a great way to engage our audience, and hope that that will be the case for you too, and how you can take a strategic approach to engaging your audience and promote your end goal, whether that is recruiting youth or hoping that, or encouraging youth to get tested and promoting HIV prevention messages. So using social media as part of your program is a dynamic and ever-changing component, and pushing content all the time without a specific strategy can lead to wasted content and time on your end. So we're hoping that today's webinar will help to improve your overall social media strategy. So you have to start one small step at a time. As I mentioned, social media tools take time to build, but it's very important to start and then to keep moving forward. And so we like to reflect on this quote from Martin Luther King that says, if you can't fly, then run, and if you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl, but whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. So we just wanted to find out from all of you today on the call where you are with social media, and we're hoping you can answer this quick poll. Is your organization crawling, walking, running, or flying with social media? And we should be popping up a poll here for you to answer in just a moment. If you can just answer that poll with how you're doing with social media. Okay, great. So I think we're going to take a look at the answers. And we're just waiting for them to come through. It's just taking a few moments here. So currently we are crawling with the WebEx platform. But so it looks like about 54% of you feel like you're walking, so it sounds like you sort of got the hang of it, but looking for ways to improve. 35% of you are in the crawling stage, so that's okay. Like I said, the main point is to always keep moving forward and keep trying new things and revising your strategy. So I think today you'll find that we have a number of ideas that you can take away from today's webinar to implement with your program. So just quickly to go over the structure for today's webinar, we're going to dive into some details on social media usage with Michael, and then we're going to go over what we did to implement the quiz for What Works, and then how you can develop a similar quiz for your organization or program. And then we have some other social media activities of ways to create innovative strategies to engage people online. And we'll be having a couple different Q&A sessions throughout, so definitely note down your questions, and then we'll stop for questions at a couple different points. All right, so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michael.
Hey. Thank you so much, Liesl. I really appreciate it, and I'm really excited to be here this afternoon. So hello to everyone. We are, as Liesl articulated, going to talk about some work that we've been doing around social media, specifically using interactive content to engage and sort of work with audiences to both excite them around information that particularly deals with our topic areas, but also really sort of figure out how we can think better about our content, think better about social media, and think better about how to engage our audiences. So we're going to talk a little broadly here about some general ideas around social media usage before we kick off with the specifics that we worked on, because I think it's always really important to sort of think about where social media is right now and how it's functioning. And what we have right here is the general sort of population's use of social media. And you'll see some stats here on the screen that I will specifically speak to, but I want to talk broadly about how these things sort of play out across the landscapes. So these are some top-line metrics for general population's use of social media, and you'll notice the prevalence and the reach of Facebook. 22% of the world's population is on Facebook. So when we are here at 3Spot thinking about how we engage with audiences and how we engage across social media, we always think about Facebook because it's the broadest audience and it's the most plentiful. And from research and from practice, we know that there is great lead generation with Facebook, and there's also great opportunities for testing. So a lot of the engagement that we did during this process involved Facebook simply because of that sort of massive reach and that ability to sort of really find an audience and develop sort of keywords or develop thoughts around those audiences, test collateral, test content, test messaging, those kinds of things. But it's really important, as you'll see in these stats here, these are pretty broad stats, but in your own practice of social media, as we know a lot of you are walking and crawling, it's important to think about what platforms mean and what they can provide for your audiences, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically to that as we go on. But just another sort of huge fact that isn't listed here, social media marketing and advertising is changing daily, and it's estimated that by the end of this year, we'll spend more than $40 billion on internet ads instead of TV ads. So there really is an opportunity to get into the space here because it's a big sort of moneymaker, and a lot of audiences and a lot of organizations, small business organizations, big organizations, are really capitalizing on that. And we're going to talk about how we did a little bit of that today. We're going to go to the next slide now. And so this slide is more specifically talking about social media use with young adults and youth. What we tried to do was, for this presentation, we really wanted to break out the audiences because it's such a broad topic, as I sort of mentioned earlier, and as Liesl sort of articulated a little bit earlier, that we sort of have this multiplicity of audiences, and I really wanted to be able to sort of focus on all of the different things happening here. So across the stats here, you'll notice that Facebook is no longer the most used social media platform among teens. Pew came out with a report most recently talking about the change of engagement with youth and specifically where they were. Though we know Facebook has the most people on it, thinking about what audiences are there and what content we have and what our organizational needs are, what our messaging needs are, what our content needs are going to be important. So when we're thinking about engaging youth, we want to look at things like YouTube, we want to look at things like Instagram, as well as Snapchat. And most recently, there have been a lot of changes with those platforms as they continue to grow. A lot of what we're going to talk about here today will change, but I think we're going to be thinking about how we can play in those spaces as they evolve with a lot of the work that we're doing here. So YouTube and Snapchat are the most frequently used, and like I said earlier, it's important to know your content, especially now that Snapchat most recently started thinking about analytics. So they're allowing creators to actually have control over what they can sort of produce, but then give them insights to what that production looks like. So Snapchat is going to become, I think, across the industry, a lot of social media people or insiders and sort of industry folks are talking about what's happening with Snapchat and how there's such a competition for this need to get to audiences. So we'll see a little bit of a rise in Snapchat, I think, over the next few years, especially with these younger audiences starting at age 13. So that's important to think about. So 95% of teens have access to smartphones, and almost half of teens report being online all the time. So there is consistent opportunity to engage with young people, but again, we want to think about how we do that smartly for ourselves, how we do that smartly for young people, but also how we make sense of the content and the engagement tactics that work best for our different audiences. And so we're going to take a look at this next slide, which sort of gives us a huge sort of overlay of the land. And what I wanted to do here was really sort of put demographics up against all of the different channels and sort of give you sort of whet your appetite around what those things might look like. And a little bit of what we've already talked about is sort of being covered here, right? Facebook has 2 billion users. YouTube has the most time on attention in terms of 40 minutes a day with the average time of use. Twitter is a news platform, really sort of functions on its feed and its wall. Instagram is pictorial. LinkedIn is really sort of professional based, and Snapchat is where you'll find those quick sort of stories and those quick sort of movement pieces for younger generations. But I think one of the things that's going to be important when looking at these different things is that you focus, as we've highlighted here, on the users for each platform and then the time each user spends, the sort of estimated time that the platform suggests that users spend on the platform, and then the best industries. One of the things that was really important for the work that we did was thinking about the best industry for the type of content that we're providing. So we know that we have multiplicities of audiences across the board, but where are they? And where will specific content like healthcare or tech or retail or, you know, drinking water or environmentalism, where does all of that actually play out in terms of what platforms are the best possibilities for those things? So it's important to think about those as we're moving forward here too, which is why I kind of wanted to put this bit of a snapshot up. But I also want to talk about one more thing that I think is really crucial, and you'll see it come up in the campaign that we did. Video is sort of ruling the day, and you're going to hear a lot about video over the course of the next few years because video and how we access video and how we interact with video is changing so much so that, like, Blockbuster doesn't exist, for example, right? But video is occupying at least 85% of people's time. It's suggested and reported that 85% of video on Facebook is watched without sound. So people are so in love with moving images that they're willing to watch them without sound, right? So we want to think about, especially when we're putting things up, how we hold on to the audience's attention and how we do those things smartly as we move through all of these different engagements. And so we'll look at the next slide, which sort of talks a little bit about a sort of lay of the land. So a lot of the stuff that we just sort of talked about is here, again, specifically looking at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram because they're the leaders in this space, at least in the work that we're doing here. And so one of the things, a few of the things I wanted to talk about were notice what each platform is known for. We kind of highlighted a little bit of that earlier. Pay attention to the audience in your content. Leveraging the resources you have with potential partners and organizations. You'll see a lot of that in the Instagram world as well as the Facebook world. But more importantly, one of the things that I think is really important to mention again, video and mobile. So when you're thinking about producing content or trying to engage youth or engaging anyone really, specifically in our current landscape, the digital landscape, thinking mobile first is really important. And even when we began sort of this engagement here, we thought about what would work for mobile as well as desktop because we know, like we said earlier, 95% of youth have mobile phones. So we need to make sure that we're meeting them where they are with content that works across the board, okay? And so the next slide is going to look at the quiz that we actually sort of thought about, or quizzes on social media more largely. Again, this is an overlay slide, but I'm just going to talk to some key points that I really think are important to mention here. Quizzes are known as interactive content, and interactive content is sort of content that engages the audience by making the audience do something, to take some action. And that's what our social media marketing is all about. How do we get the user to create some action based on the content that we're providing? And quizzes, sometimes called personality tests or assessments, are ways of getting the audience involved, and they help the audience to sort of be engaged in the process without just sort of being a passerby. So you'll see a number of stats here on quizzes and the work that happens in quizzes, but I really want us to think about at least 3 key attributes that come from the CDC when we're thinking about content in general, but I think is one of the things that makes interactive content work so well is its personalization, its presentation, and participation. So you want to make sure that you're personalizing your content, your quizzes. You want to make sure that they're presented in a way that works. Again, that's the conversation about making sure that you know the platform they should be on, making sure you know the audience, and also ensuring that you know which audiences are going to be receiving and delivering those assets. And also participation. How do we get the audience involved? And that was really the sort of crux for us with this experiment. And so thinking about quizzes was a really sort of interesting way to approach it, but we also wanted to find out why quizzes were so successful. And for instance, we thought about all of the different organizations, including even the New York Times, as you'll see in the next slide, which used a quiz. And that quiz went down as the New York Times #1 piece of content in 2013. And it's so interesting what's happening with interactive content, I think, specifically around this sort of BuzzFeed quiz world. It's this idea that these quizzes are so interactive and they're so engaging, but they're allowing the user to have autonomy and participation in the process of creating something in the way I don't know users have had in the past. So, for instance, the New York Times has created an entire interactive news desk, and it's just a group of people who've been charged to create interactive assets for the entire organization. And it behooves us the point that, you know, when you're thinking about these kinds of things, even the big organizations are thinking about them. So I really wanted to show this quiz, which I took, and I'm sure a number of you probably took, that told me I was from New Orleans, Louisiana, and I am, so it was spot on. And it's that kind of stuff, that kind of personalization, that kind of involvement, that kind of grabbing you from behind the screen that pulls you into the content. And that's one of the reasons we think it's so important to have interactive content, because it provides education, enlightenment, and entertainment, but it also creates and builds a sense of loyalty, creates engagement, and in some cases you get a lot of lead generation. And you'll hear more of that as we go through this. So I'm going to pass it off back to Liesl, and we'll keep going on the process here.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael. Okay, great. So now we are going to dive into what we did specifically on our project. So we're going to go over the goals, audience, channels, et cetera, and how we came up with the different ideas and chose the quiz as a way to engage our audience, what went into writing it, the advertising and distribution, and then how we continued to test and iterate throughout the advertising period and how we assess our results. So first, jumping in, our end goal was to promote the content on the website to our audiences. That's been one of our main goals all along for the project. And for what works in youth HIV, we've always defined our audience as adult champions and peer champions. So for developing this social media campaign, we broke these down further in three-spot, and we worked together with three-spot on this, differentiating between specialists whose primary role includes HIV prevention among youth, such as HIV administrators and program coordinators for adult champions, and for peer leaders, this was, or for peer champions, this was peer leaders and youth volunteers, for instance. And then the generalists are folks that may incorporate HIV prevention as part of a broader curriculum or program, but they aren't doing HIV every day. So that was how we kind of broke out our audience into 4 different segments. And then in order to promote our content, we realized that we really had to create more opportunity for engagement instead of just continuously pushing our content directly on Twitter and via email, which we were doing, and it wasn't consistently having a high engagement rate for us. So we worked with three-spot to enhance our social media strategy with the primary goal of increasing engagement to then promote the content. And we'll go into that a bit more, but I think it echoes some of what Michael was just talking about in terms of really taking the user and putting them in the content itself. So we looked to dive a little deeper into our goals and audiences, and we realized that we weren't reaching all of our audience segments that I just outlined for you. So while our page views were up about 150% in the last 8 months compared to the first 8 months since we had launched the website, 15% of visitors were clicking through to other websites from our site. And by using Facebook's analyzer, we found people on our list were very likely to have an advanced degree. So through that through that analysis, as well as some other data, we concluded that we were reaching the specialists amongst the adult champions, but that we weren't reaching the generalists or either of the segments within the peer champions. So we also recognized that we were only, well, we recognized we were only using Twitter. That's the only platform that we use for our project, and the audiences that we were hoping to reach might be on other social platforms. So for instance, 24% of Americans use Twitter, whereas 79% use Facebook. So we know from the data that Michael just went over that adults are more likely to be on Facebook. So we determined that we need to branch out a little bit in terms of the platforms that we were hoping to engage our audience on. And for the project, we don't actually have a Facebook page or profile for What Works in Youth HIV, so we actually use our corporate profile for JSI to run the advertising through, and you'll see that reflected in some of the examples. So I don't know if Michael or Chris, do you want to jump in here on anything?
Yeah, just one higher level point here is when you're at the stage of trying to figure out who you're talking to, being very brutally honest about who you're talking to is very, very important. I think one of the largest pitfalls I've run across in healthcare and in public health is that people often say, well, I'm talking to my community or I'm talking to the general public. If you find yourself using those words, you might want to step back and rethink about who you actually need to speak to in order to achieve your goal or achieve some impact, mostly because the more specific your audience is, the better your chances are at actually achieving that goal or achieving that metric that you set out to do.
Yeah, really good point. So moving on to generating ideas, we brainstormed ideas for how to engage our audience and looking again at those 4 segments. And we took the opportunity to look at some promising social media tactics that work really well in non-public health spaces, such as the quiz, which Michael just showed you had been the leading content for the New York Times. I think it was in 2012. So some examples that we considered were this option of kind of myth versus fact of this example of immigration reform here, which, you know, we see that used across social in different ways, a quiz, and also a conversation guide, so kind of leading people through a conversation of answering different questions in order to help teach some specific content. So we chose the quizzes and crowdsourcing, which was another idea we had considered. The crowdsourcing of ideas didn't totally work for us, so we're not presenting on that today, but the quizzes did, and so this is just highlighting that for you, and that we did try a couple of different things, and some of it did work and some of it didn't work. I'll also say that we chose the quiz, just again touching on what Michael had said earlier, because it was a very interactive way to engage people. We were actively engaging them in the content by having them answer questions, and so we really liked that more active way to engage them versus the myth versus fact. And also one of the things we recognized that we were doing previous to this on Twitter was we were pushing people to the content from our Twitter handle, and instead through this idea we were giving the people the content right where they were, and then hoping that that would drive them to the website for more information. So that was a real key difference and a very simple kind of redefining of how we got our content out there. So again, I think the difference I'm trying to highlight is that we put the content right where our audience was, right there in social, instead of trying to push them from social to the website to find the content for themselves. Chris or Michael, anything to jump in there?
Nope, you said it all, Liesl. Yep.
Okay, all right. So another way that for this phase 2 of developing the quiz, we did do a short survey via our email list about the topics to find out what people would be most interested in, and it came back that recruiting and engaging youth and PrEP were the top 2 areas. So this was one of the ways that provided some input into how we chose PrEP as the focus of our quiz. So the next step is writing the quiz, and we really wanted to kind of empower people with the information. We went through multiple iterations before we had a final draft, and we made sure that we didn't want to let people down with getting all the answers wrong, so we wanted them to get a good score so that they would feel empowered with kind of knowing that they did know some of the information, and then also in the answers that we provided, they kind of served as educational reminders for people and reinforcement of their knowledge. So once they completed the quiz, we directed the quiz takers to a page where they could review their answers, and we provided resources with more information about each question. So for the ones that they may have gotten wrong, there was additional information as well as usually a link to find out more information about the particular area. We limited the quiz to 10 questions, and you can see here just a screenshot of the beginning of the quiz that we did. So the first question was true or false. PrEP stands for pre-exposure prophylaxis. So it was interesting to see the differences or the places where people did well on the quiz and didn't do as well. So the next step was creating an advertising and distribution schedule. So here is an example of the ad that we did create. We tested a couple of different headline options in the first few days of promoting the quiz, and we first launched it on Twitter and Facebook. We did create a GIF, so the PrEP pill kind of wiggled back and forth, and we chose that over a more static image as a way to get people's attention when they're scrolling through their news feed and would come across this advertisement, so hopefully to get them to pause for a second and take the quiz. And so in terms of how we actually went about distributing the quiz, we, like I said, we tested it on Facebook and Twitter to start, and we used the tools within the platforms to define the audiences. So for Facebook, we used demographics and people's likes or interests to create the audience, and I'll show you screenshots of those in just a minute. And for Twitter, we define the audience based on lookalike handles. So within each of the different platforms, there's different ways that the audience segments get set up. And so you have to, kind of step back and think about what would be the best way to align the audience that you're trying to reach based on the criteria that you're able to select from within the advertising platform. We based our budgets on healthcare averages, and the campaign length was a full month. And we had weekly check-ins amongst the full What Works team, and with 3Spot included, on how to optimize it each week and how to just kind of tinker with who we were targeting and the budget in order to get the greatest engagement. Do you guys have anything to add there?
Yeah, I just wanted to say you hit the nail on the head with the sort of differences in thinking about demographics and audiences. So it's important, as I sort of articulated earlier and Liesl articulated before me, that you need to really be thinking about keywords or demographics or getting a sense of who your audience is, because each platform is really different. Facebook is really great because it has a very sort of drill down way of thinking about a number of audiences, of which has a lot changed as a result of a lot of privacy concerns. But you want to think about different ways to sort of keyword or persona or, sort of mark your audiences, because you won't find that same sort of flexibility across platforms. Twitter, as Liesl articulated, is very lookalike audience-based. There are a little less keywords. There isn't much possibility to sort of drill down in the same way there is on Facebook. So you want to be really clear about who you're trying to get your ads to as you attack or approach each different platform.
Great, thanks, Michael. So, like I mentioned, we were just going to give you a quick screenshot of a quick screenshot of what the kind of the additional details on some of the audience segments. So this one is for on Facebook for the Adult Champion HIV Specialist audience, and you can see we matched up people's interests, so community health worker, HIV/AIDS research, sexual health clinic, Start Talking Stop HIV is a CDC campaign. So these were ways that we designed the audience within Facebook to do for the advertising. And so next I'll show you how we did it on Twitter. And like I mentioned, for the campaign targets for Twitter, we built audience based on lookalike handles. So we thought about who else is in our What Works News HIV space, and identified which handles would build the audience in terms of adult champions and HIV specialists that we were looking for. So we found that the audience on Twitter was less engaged and was costing us a lot more per click than on Facebook. So after about, I think, a week or two, we stopped the campaign on Twitter and doubled down on Facebook. So we used the money that we put the money that we would have used on Twitter towards the advertising on Facebook. And as long as we maintained or improved our click-through rates, we continued what we were doing and then expanded the range of audiences by increasing the size of using kind of similar likes on Facebook, as well as expanding to additional segments. We also initially, when we first launched it on Twitter and Facebook, we also were testing using Google Forms versus SurveyMonkey because they had some different functionality. But ultimately, the Google Forms hosted quiz performed better. I think more people completed the quizzes, and so we ultimately stopped using the SurveyMonkey hosted quiz and just promoted the Google Form quiz. So just some little things that, in the end, improved overall engagement.
Liesl, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I think built into this number 5, or the step number 5, is the fact that you're going to eventually fail while doing this. And the great thing about failing in this segment is that you can actually see how you failed and how badly you failed, and that's a good thing. Whereas, you don't know how many times you failed communicating a message to someone with a flyer, with a Facebook ad. You know that. And then you're able to improve upon that, and then you can prove to your funders, to your boss, to whomever, that you actually accomplished something instead of just putting out like a flyer. And I'm just using flyers as an example. They're incredibly effective pieces of communication for some things, but when it comes to getting messages and being able to identify how you've moved a metric forward, this particular medium does a very good job at that. And you just have to know, especially if you're crawling at the stage or you're just starting to walk, is like becoming comfortable with failure, becoming comfortable with constant iteration, and being able to communicate that in a very rational and metric-centered approach is usually the way to sell this through to folks.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Thanks for chiming in, Chris. So just to give you a sense of, this is a screenshot of what it looks on the advertising platform for Twitter, and it's a little hard to see, but I just wanted to give you a sense of, you can see we had on the left-hand side the prep quiz for SurveyMonkey and the prep quiz for Google Forms. It's a little hard to read the some of the fine details, but we could gauge how many impressions each campaign was getting, how much was being spent, and so the one that was doing better, we would then promote more. So we just wanted to give you a snapshot on the back end of what it looks like in terms of comparing the different campaigns that we're running and how we use the metrics to improve our advertising. So a little bit on our results. In the end, we had 1,341 quiz respondents overall of people who finished the quiz, and they had an average score of 4.5 out of 6 across the board. So 50% of those who clicked on the quiz actually finished it. And so that's like the specifics on the actual quiz. You can see on Facebook we had over 106,000 impressions and 24,000 impressions on Twitter. We ran the Facebook campaign for about a month, whereas Twitter only ran for under 2 weeks. So you can see a big difference in the impressions as well as the amount spent. And you can see that all the way through. We derived the cost per result by looking at the number of link clicks, and the amount spent. So on Facebook, each result or each quiz taken cost 54 cents, whereas on Twitter it was $1.65. So you can see why we really doubled down on Facebook and concentrated our budget and our focus there because we're able to get to reach a lot more people. We found that the adult champion HIV specialist group responded more often to the ad, but the impressions came from the adult champion generalist. And I don't know, Michael or Chris, if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I can say a few things. I think that's an interesting stat, and the thing about, I think if we talk about ads in the social media marketing space, it's a really sort of interesting space because a lot of it is, as you know, self-identified. So a lot of the way targeting works is that people have sort of said that they agree to these things, and then algorithms from each side of the platform go out and sort of find those audiences for you. And so you'll notice that like impressions and reach are interesting numbers and they change, but what's really important, as Liesl articulated, was paying attention to your click-through rate because that will affect your cost. So the lower your click-through rate, the higher your cost because the algorithm is trying to find the audience member that you have stated that you're interested in finding. So it will spend more money to try to sort of get that bid to ensure that it gets that person. So you want to make sure when you're optimizing, as Chris articulated, in terms of thinking about whether or not you're failing or you're succeeding or you're actually sort of figuring out who your audience is more than anything else, you really want to be paying attention to your click-through rate and your cost per result. So you have to have a sense of what you're willing to spend for someone to actually click on your ad. And sometimes that ranges to $4.56 to 53 cents, right? That just really sort of depends on the definition of the campaign and the definition of the ability for the platform to find that audience member. Another thing I really want to talk about is these benchmarks. These are benchmarks that come from the industry standard. These aren't necessarily benchmarks that might or might not work for your individual campaign. Again, it's really important to think about what you want the results to look like or what you envision the results might look like, have some sort of hypothesis about what the results are, so that later on when you're writing reports or you're, as Chris articulated, making sense of why this might matter long term for you, you have something to benchmark from. So now that we've done this pilot or this exercise, we have these numbers instead of those benchmarks here to sort of go from, but we use those benchmarks that you see here listed to sort of guide our practice. So we really wanted to keep our costs low because we had a clear definition of who we assumed our audiences were. And that's sort of what actually the campaign indicated, and that's what you see here. So we got a lot of clicks, which was really, really great, so people were really interested in the content, and then full on through, we got a number of people who actually completed the quiz, who actually went to the follow-up pages and got the resources and were able to sort of really dive into the entire engaged experience. So you want to just make sure that you're optimizing and paying attention to the numbers because they will be telling you, as Chris articulated, whether or not you're doing well, whether or not you need to be doing more, if you need to change creative, asset, messaging, platform. It all sort of depends. So yeah, that's the part I wanted to sort of articulate.
Great, thank you. So I think that actually I'm going to pass it off to back to you guys to talk about how our attendees today can develop a quiz on your own.
Okay, so we're going to try to go a little bit faster through this section so we obviously capture your questions. The goal of this is obviously to provide a little bit of a worksheet and a little bit of a how-to guide, as well as sprinkle in some tips about how you can go off and create a quiz on your own tomorrow should you decide to do that. So on the next slide, we kind of have at least six major steps that we've outlined and we actually accomplished. We're going to start with goals, audiences, channels, and outcomes, generating ideas, writing the quiz, going through advertising and distribution, iterating, and then obviously coming back and assessing results. And this is fairly linear, but expect this to be kind of a circle. So after you assess results from one quiz, you might go off and start doing not a quiz, but maybe a new messaging campaign, or another quiz that's kind of like a series of quizzes, and you start at number one again. So it's kind of a constant learn and improve process. So diving into goals, obviously, when you're talking about goals, especially for these specific efforts, you're looking at them to be very specific and action-oriented. As I talked about before, your audience should be a very specific demographic or have a very specific set of behaviors. They don't all need to be 18 to 24-year-olds. They could just be people who are willing to walk or step foot inside of an HIV clinic. That's a behavior that they're willing to do. And that might not just be 18 to 24-year-olds. Obviously, those channels, as Michael pointed out before, should align with those audiences and goals. So after you say, hey, I'm talking to 24 to 34-year-olds, and my goal for them is to really understand the risks and benefits of PrEP should their partner have HIV or be HIV positive, and notice how specific that was, then probably the best platform for them is going to be Instagram, because that's where they're the most engaged on, and it's obviously a very visual platform, so you'll have to adjust your messaging to meet that channel. And then obviously your outcomes should be specific and measurable, and I think if we go to the next slide, what we've provided is a little bit of a formula to kind of start thinking about this. So if you wanted to just fill in the blanks essentially with this, starting with our goal is to blank, insert an audience, insert a social media channel, and you hope to insert some sort of outcome and measurable metric. We have a couple examples of a good example and a bad example there. I'll kind of let you read these after you receive the deck because they get a little in-depth, but the goal really there is it's a very specific audience, and we're talking about a very specific metric. And these might be related to your program goals. They might be related to a specific grant that you've received. So you can work that language into this, which we've done in the past, which kind of makes it a little bit easier for you to pivot and say, hey, remember that grant proposal you gave me? I wrote a goal for this for a social media channel, and guess what happened? Here's the impact that it created. Give me more money, or a round of applause.
Yes.
And then moving on to generating ideas. Generating ideas is obviously the fun part. This is something where you obviously have to think about the audience specifically as well as the channel, and focus really in on what is in it for them, not what's in it for you. Start from your audience's perspective constantly and start asking yourself, what are they going to get for this? Is it a selfish benefit? Am I going to get a prize at the end of this quiz? Am I going to be smarter than my friends? Or am I going to be doing good in the world? Is it some sort of social benefit that they'll be creating? And usually we do this by just having people generate 3 or 5 ideas on their own, come together in a group, put them all on a wall, talk through them a little bit, and then arrange them in some sort of schematic so you have a good idea of which ones you want to execute. This example we have in the slide here rates particular tactics based on how impactful they could potentially be and how much effort you are going to expend by putting them in. That's one way to rate ideas and decide which ones to do. There's other ways of doing that too, by potentially looking at how narrow your audiences are versus how much effort you want to expend, how long something's going to take in order to execute. So there's a bunch of different ways to do that, but have some sort of schematic or some sort of organizing principle so you can decide what you want to do when you're generating a quiz. And then we get into the nitty-gritty details.
Yeah, so when writing the quiz, these are, as Chris articulated earlier, you can read this offline because you will have access to this deck, but I think it's important to pay attention to capturing the information and ensuring the results. We had a sort of longer conversation earlier about results, but you kind of want to know what the end game is, right? You want to know what you expect to see a little bit, and then be surprised by what you actually find so that you can reiterate. But you also want to think about capturing information. Social media is really great for lead generation. Sometimes audiences don't already know about a product, and through these kinds of interactive opportunities, quizzes, maps, games, any sort of content, a white paper that moves, an infographic, anything that has some sort of functionality that allows the audience to take action. If you can, when you can, it's important to figure out how you can capture that so you can learn from them, but also encourage them to sort of engage with you on a long-term basis. So thinking about capturing information and thinking about results are really crucial, but these are some of the steps we went through when we were brainstorming just to sort of come up with quiz content and ensuring that there was someone in the room who was always willing to challenge whatever those ideas were so that we could get as robust and as broad ideas as possible so that as many audience segments can come to the table as we need. And so the next slide is going to talk a little bit about advertising and distribution. These are, so when we do ad campaigns here at ThreeSpot and usually across the board when industry insiders do ad campaigns, they're always thinking about these specific things in terms of how the campaign's life will look. So similar to the earlier piece on definition goals, a sort of workshop, these are some of the questions we ask when we're putting together advertising campaigns, and it includes things like campaign placements, campaign goals, campaign measurements and analytics. There's a slide after this that sort of continues the work, campaign title, campaign strategy, and campaign wrap. But inside of each one of those is a question, and we want to make sure that we're filling out those questions or thinking about those questions so we know where the campaign is being placed, what our goals are, what we expect to measure, what we expect to run, how long we expect to run it, what our actual strategy is, whether or not we're using Facebook for a little while or Twitter or Instagram or Pinterest, or if we're going to dial it back once we find out something new, if we want to pocket the money instead of redistributing it to another platform, right? Those are all things we need to be thinking about ahead of time because when you're in the rush of the campaign, you're going to want to do things and change things to make sure that you're meeting your goals. So you want to make sure that you have some sort of strategy for that. So that's why we sort of articulate all of these things. And then when it's over, as Chris has already articulated, when you're making sense of what happened to funders or to people who will make decisions about future purse string offerings, you want to make sure that you have some sort of sense of a wrap, right? You want to sort of wrap up what you've done. So thinking about writing all of this stuff ahead of time or planning or strategizing for these kinds of things ahead of time will give you that wrap, and all you'll have to do is plug in your numbers and present what your offerings were and go from there. And so the next slide is advertising and distribution. This is similarly to what Liesl showed a little earlier in terms of thinking about how to actually go and find the audience. This is the distribution back end of Facebook. So this sort of tells you, once you plug in your audience, Facebook is really, really good, and that's, I know, Facebook is really, really good about helping you make sense of who the audience is and whether or not that audience is even available on their platform. So you'll see they have audience definition in terms of the reach of people. You can also see the start date, the end date. You can set a daily budget or a lifetime budget. So if you know if you have $1,500 and that's all you're going to spend on this campaign, you can tell Facebook, I have $1,500, that's it. Once you've allocated all of these funds, please stop running this campaign and provide me a report. Or you can tell Facebook, I'm willing to spend $30 a day for 3 weeks. I don't know what that looks like, but Facebook will go out and match your audience sets based on your keywords, based on your behaviors, based on your individual audience makeup and your demographics, and try to find those audiences for you. And what it will do beforehand, as you'll see here, is try to give you a little bit of a projection of that, so you have some sense of what that might be. So that's the really good thing about Facebook in terms of its definite algorithm and sort of broadening the reach of demographics. So again, with test and iterate, as we talked a little bit earlier, I always think of campaigns and ads as the living opportunity to sort of reach your audience and to expose them to your brand. So it's important, as we did here, to start small. start with your own channels and then sort of figure out what your sweet spot is and sort of then start thinking about going out from there. One of the things that was really helpful for us was that we were able to think about 2 different platforms in 2 different ways, but we found out that our own channel wasn't necessarily the channel that worked well for us, right? So we had to think about how we leverage other channels, but we had to know that kind of stuff starting small before we were able to launch out bigger. You want to always consider variety in platforms, variety in ad types, in creative, in messaging. Always think about different ways to reach the audience. Monitor progress so that you can adjust audiences and optimize as needed, and consider every result a learning. I am an educator at heart, and so nothing to me is wasted, and as Chris has articulated earlier, your failure is success just in another light, because it teaches you something you probably didn't know or reaffirms something you did. So it's important to pay attention to all of the learnings coming out of everything that happens with your campaigns. Okay? The next slide is the access of results from the back end on Twitter, and this sort of gives you a sort of sense of exactly what the campaign looks like and what the actual numbers were. So you can actually sort of see what impressions look like, you can see how much you spent, you can see what times, what dates were helpful for you. You can go back in and actually look at the creative and get a sense of how the creative was distributed. It really sort of gives you robust insight and gives you a chance to sort of make sense, like we did, of whether or not you need to stop using a platform, continue using a platform, even emulate this campaign. You can actually go in and copy this exact audience set and redistribute another type of asset to it, because you know that this audience works and you know it's going to work on these specific days, right? So those are some key learnings that also sort of come out of there. I'm going to toss it back over to Liesl because I think she might have some final points before we get to the next slide.
Great, thanks, Michael and Chris. Well, I think we actually want to take some questions. So if you have any questions, you can chat them in, put them into the chat box. It's on the right-hand side of your screen, and chat them to the host, and we will get to them. So we did have a question that came in that I'm going to toss to you, Michael. The question was, do you have demographics for Pinterest?
Yes, we do have demographics for Pinterest. So similar to that first slide, which listed all of the different platforms, I didn't list Pinterest simply because it wasn't one of the immediate platforms that we were engaging with, and I'm glad the question came up because there are demographics for all of those individual audiences and sets across the platforms. So we know that 36% of the audience on Pinterest is between the ages of 18 and 29. 34% of that audience is between 30 and 49. 28% is between 50 and 64. And 16% of Pinterest audience is 65 years older and more. 60% of the users on Pinterest, which was in that general sort of bucket of information at the top of my slide, are users who are female, and 70 million mobile users are on Pinterest. Of Pinterest, 200 million active users, 70 million of them are mobile users. So when you're thinking about it, as I sort of articulated earlier, make sure that you're thinking about mobile users because they're a huge chunk of the audience. And on average, users spend 14.2 minutes per day on Pinterest. And interestingly enough, millennials, those who fall, I think they've sort of shifted a little bit between the ages of 1979 to maybe 1996, I think is the new sort of terminology for millennials. Millennials use Pinterest as much as Instagram, and that makes sense simply because Instagram is a photography-based medium, and in a lot of ways, so is Pinterest. So if you're thinking about using Pinterest, there are 2 million active users, 70 million are on mobile, 60% are female, and the highest audience set, 36% of those audience members are between the ages of 18 and 29.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to Pinterest, you got to consider the channel and the medium highly too as well. It's a channel that's used a little bit more for passive and exploratory experience rather than an engaging experience. People on Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat are communicating back and forth often. On Pinterest, they're sharing stuff back and forth, but they're more often looking at content, sharing content, creating boards. So that kind of aligns with your goals, your strategy, and what your idea is to engage folks. Like if you want people to like collect stuff for you and put it in a board and into a community board, that's great because that's what that channel is meant to do. So make sure you consider how people use it too, not just the demographics.
Yep.
Because it'll be more effective both ways.
Great, thank you. So we did have a question come in that was asking if we can view the whole prep quiz that we developed, and we do have that posted on our website, and we'll share that link with you shortly. And we have one more question that came in about funding sources, which we will look into and we'll come back to after the next section of slides. So we'll move on to our next section that provides some ideas on additional ways you can engage people online, additional social media activities that Chris and Michael will share with you.
So yeah, if you're at that point where you're walking a little bit more, you've done a few campaigns, you've tested some content, you know your audiences, there are a few other social media activities that you can engage in order to increase engagement or find new audiences or just deliver up your content in different ways. So a few of those are contests and giveaways, exploring user participation, or sometimes this is called user-generated content, using influencers or celebrities, forums and webinars, which obviously we're on one right now, and then the last one is custom, which we'll get to some examples of as well. Just for your reference, we put together a little bit of a visual representation about these activities when it comes to level of effort and potential engagement. Liesl, is that next, or is that the end of the slide, end of the presentation?
Yeah, that's next. We can go through them now.
Okay, great. So one great example of a contest and giveaway is to literally give away something for a good cause. In this case, Prezio and Hamilton gave away a trip to go see Hamilton in London, and you got to meet Lynn and Manuel. But as a result of that, you donated to a good cause that was either like NRDC or I believe ACLU or something of that nature. You can take a look at this link. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It just has, the giveaway has to tie back to what the audience wants. And Hamilton tickets are a very desirable item for a lot of people. And again, it gives you that good social benefit too. It's like you're participating in something that's not necessarily totally selfish. So even if you lose, you win. And I think the next slide shows the write-up for if you, after you submit, what you actually, if you didn't win. So there's things to think about like that with contests and giveaways that are hugely important. It's not necessarily what you're giving away, but what you get if you potentially fail. And the next slide gives you some high-level good tips to think about when you're exploring stuff like this. Offering a runner-up benefit is one that I talked about. We want to make sure contests are really easy for people to enter, that it requires less than a 2-minute interaction. And we want to make sure that you're definitely getting information from that contest. Michael touched on this earlier with quizzes. If you're not getting email, some sort of like name or some sort of zip code, or at least asking them, getting them involved in a poll, you probably should be, because you're giving something to them, they're more than likely to get something back to you. Right. And that could inform your future campaigns as well as your future audience identification efforts.
It also closes the engagement loop, right? Engagement is a two-way street, right? So you want to make sure that you're keeping that process open so that it is a social experiment and that it's also very sort of conversational in that way. Just aside.
No, that's okay. Another way of doing this is user participation. A lot of people talk about user-generated content. A lot of people have people create messages, write letters, do petitions, things of that nature. Just so that everyone on the phone is very clearly aware, usually around 1 to 2% of that content you can actually use later on. 80 to 98% of it is usually unusable, either because it's not interesting enough or it's not necessarily it's either not suitable for work or doesn't actually meet the need. However, it does allow people to participate in something that in a campaign in your idea or your cause. So I Am a Witness is a great example of this. This was put on by the Ad Council. It's basically asking Generation Zers to identify bullies online and say, hey, that's not okay. And they did a little video for this. They did some social media marketing. They have little snippets of this video they have all up on YouTube. But as a part of this effort, if you go to the next slide, they created a whole series of emojis and icons that kids could use online, both in text and in comment boards, and created model conversations for them to identify bullying. So it's not necessarily an adult saying, no, 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 you're a bully. It's another kid coming to the other kid's rescue and saying, hey, you're a bully, stop that. That's not okay. And this is a great form of user participation because of actually having people engage in a cause for a common good. Good tips for user participation: make sure the activity is definitely socially desirable. This is obviously a socially desirable activity. Engage, exchange information again. When you ask people to provide a response or participate in something, make sure there's always a canned response or a response that they can easily select and send in. Mostly because some people don't want to spend the time writing a custom response or spend the full time to say, hey, that's not okay, but they'll send out an emoji to someone who's bullying them or bullying somebody else. And again, shoot for about a 2 to 5 minute interaction. 5 is actually a little high. I would definitely focus on 2 minutes to get everyone to do something, to do anything. And then 3, obviously you see this online all too often. Celebrities are paid very handsomely to post on Instagram with a lot of brands, as well as on Twitter. But there's some influencer and celebrity engagement that you can get folks to kind of sign on to, and because their heroes are essentially doing it. This is a campaign that we helped with for the USO, which was called Flex for the Forces. They used a few celebrities to essentially flex their muscles in support of service members, and then they passed it on, somewhat like the Ice Bucket Challenge, if you're familiar with that. These things were meant to capture people for an exchange of information, which was a message campaign, if we go to the next slide. So going back to my earlier point of making sure you're always exchanging information, we had people write messages to the military and service members and then distributed them to centers themselves. And what we actually found from this campaign is that this particular audience defied the I don't want to spend too much time on this rule. They spent a good deal of time, about 45 minutes, writing very custom messages. And this is a good example of something where you will find surprises against norms and against statistics with certain audiences. And sometimes it's okay to find that because then you've found something very, very key and novel to your audience that you can capitalize on later. And then when it comes to just influencer and celeb engagement, obviously you want to make sure that the influencer or celeb should be audience relevant. You should make sure that the influencer just doesn't post something, but asks people to participate with them. You look at celebs or influencers like role models. They're giving you the best behavior possible. Well, we hope they are. And you want to be able to use their networks to do that too as well. I think this is a good side note too, when you're, especially for those that are just starting off with social media, don't be afraid to post a couple times. In fact, the half-life of a post, Michael, I'm going to put you on the spot. What is the rule of thumb?
Oh gosh, it's not coming to me immediately. But on average, you should be posting on Twitter at least like 15 times a day, maybe, right? But like a post lives for like 30 seconds, roughly, 30 to a minute in terms of actual sort of life, right? We do know that, like, for instance, if you post an Instagram post right now, it will get 50% of its likes in the first 10 hours. So, you know, by tomorrow, your content is probably not being seen in the same way because so much is happening. There are over 500 million tweets being sent in the last hour. and we've only been engaged for like about a good hour, so they're probably like 750 million, right? So you want to make sure that you're getting your content and you're posting and reposting and sharing content as much as possible. Also with influencers, I just wanted to make sure that you remember, and a lot of you probably already know this because you deal with brands that have to sort of make sure that they are aware of these kinds of things, but celebrities and influencers are an extension of your brand. So you want to make sure that, as Chris articulated, that you are finding people who align with the causes with which you believe are the things that you're fighting for, and are actually great showcases of the great and incredible work that you're doing, so that you can continue to repost and can continue to engage with them and their networks accordingly.
All right, Lisa, we can jump to the next slide. I think we actually talked through the next slide. So you can jump to the slide after that. Obviously, forums and webinars are really great ways of interacting deeply with audiences. Obviously, we're on one today. So a webinar is more of a teaching format and a discussion format. Obviously, as you saw today, we're trying to encourage conversation throughout and at least pick up trends and adjust to questions as we go. It's a good way of hosting a webinar. Forums are a little bit more stream of consciousness and thought, and it's almost, if any of you are familiar with public relations, you kind of have to be, have to go through media training to handle one of those, because you can get caught off guard very, very easily. There are always going to be trolls in those like forum conversations or ask me anythings on Reddit. So these things require a little bit more prep, obviously, but can net better results later on.
Forums also include the Twitter chats and open conversation forums, those kinds of things.
Facebook Live, yeah.
Right, those are also other forms of interactive content that live within the locality of the platform that, as Chris articulates, can be readily used and easily used for free even.
Yep. So here's some just helpful tips that I went over. I think I want to spend a little bit more time with the ones, the social media things you see more often because they get a little bit more press, which is on the next slide. So when we're talking about doing more customized efforts, I highly recommend you start with pretty much the tried and true stuff if you're just starting out, not only to understand who your audiences are, but to make sure that you're getting your money's worth. There are some more custom, or what I call context-oriented social media campaigns that take into account the audience and do something really unusual with the medium. So for example, in Australia, the Queensland Police Department put up disappearing person alerts, like people who were missing, on Snapchat as ads, and these particular ads disappeared because they were missing people, but they also geo-fenced them in certain areas. So if a person was missing within a certain 5-mile area, that ad would only display within a certain 5-mile area. And geofencing is something that is fairly new. I mean,
yeah, a little bit.
A little bit. But something that is done with Snapchat and can be done with other social media channels as well. On the next slide, here's a really good example of doing a social media campaign without a social media channel. So social media campaigns are just all about transmitting ideas from one person to the next and hopefully creating something that everyone really loves. And this particular campaign basically asked women to turn on their out-of-office reply during Equal Pay Day. And out-of-office reply basically said, I'm not really out of office, I'm just turning on this because all women should be equally paid in the UK for their work, and they're currently not. So that when people email them, on the next slide, your return message would show up with a bunch of people who are unexpectedly out of office but are really not, and you would be forced to actually read the message. And that's really what it is all about. It's about transmitting these ideas and messages, and you don't necessarily have to have a social media channel to do that, although it's much easier to do it with a social media channel and much easier to measure that with a social media channel.
Yeah. I also think one of the things that is really interesting about this one, Chris, is that I think email was the original social media, obviously, but it's it took advantage of a social media day, right? It took advantage of the possibility of a campaign that was already existing. So you can run campaigns within campaigns, right? So for instance, World Environment Day had a Beat Plastic Pollution campaign inside of World Environment Day. So there was already attention on a given thing that you could then sort of provide more insight to that thing in a different kind of way. So it's always helpful to think about how you can leverage what might already exist so that you can start small and sort of do your own thing that might be just related to your organization but a part of a larger initiative.
So just to give you a good idea of how much time you should be spending on all of these, I think when Etsy first started doing AdWords and ad campaigns, they did a very intensive study about how much time they should be spending doing the stuff that's normal and everyday, and then the stuff that's really cool but will take a long time. And they came down to the 80-20 rule is essentially applies here too. So 80% of your time, if you're a very robust social media marketer, should probably be spent on the day-to-day optimizing your message, creating new campaigns to drive to goals that you've already predefined, probably with predefined audiences, focusing on methods that are tried and true. You know, creating videos, creating quizzes, using contests and giveaways. When you start using things like creating things like user participation, forums and webinars, and those custom engagements, you're spending a lot more time, but there's a potential for higher engagement. So it's a riskier subject, so to speak. But what it all really comes down to with any of these things on the next slide is really knowing your audience. We've harped on that today a lot, but understanding that's something that makes them go, oh, and that oh is going to be about 2 seconds of attention, just FYI. It's not going to be like, oh, I'm going to spend my afternoon figuring this thing out. It's going to be about 2 seconds of attention that you get to capture them and then bring them in to something that's engaging. And I think someone asked a question about dictation and emojis and using the proper language. This is understanding how to speak to somebody so that they know that you are speaking authentically is amazingly important, and you'll get that oh moment more often when you know that. And to get to that point, it takes a lot of practice and knowing someone who knows how to say that right in the right context. So when it comes to measuring impact, you've obviously got to make it matter to them. So, and that's the hook that we've been talking about all the time. If you're going to talk about things like public health in your ads, you're probably going to get pretty low engagement unless you're talking to public health or people who are masters in public health. If we can find a way to make public health matter to folks, in a way that's engaging to them, that either has some sort of selfish benefit, has some sort of social benefit, then they're going to be more interested. And then obviously iterating, improving, we've talked a lot about that today, but making sure that you're constantly improving on what you're doing. And that doesn't mean, like Michael said, you're like posting every day. I realize some of you come from smaller organizations where that is just not humanly possible, but even if you wanted to focus on like, okay, so for this 1 month, we know we have a fair or a festival or some sort of important health care day that we need to hit. Do something around that, and then next year, look at those results and come back to that and be like, okay, so we did this last year, and here's where we can improve upon.
Yep.
Everyone has kind of a different time scale. Everyone has different organizational size and budget, but these rules still ultimately apply.
Yep. And I think brainstorming across the board, we talked a little bit earlier about how we were generating ideas. I think those are the moments when these kinds of things become palpable, right? So you're having these conversations, you're figuring out whether or not these kinds of things work for you, but you're inviting in the possibility of more ideas, which might not necessarily be useful today, but they could be useful down the line. And if you focus on the but it comes down to this slide, you'll notice that all of these things that Chris just mentioned are what makes BuzzFeed quizzes work. They're what make that New York Times quiz work really, really well. They knew their audience. They made me go, oh, because I was like, oh my God, I'm really from New Orleans. They made it feel like it mattered to me, and then they captivated my attention and sort of collected information to potentially try to take me on as a subscriber, right? So they kept they kept me engaged throughout the entire process, but they did it kind of across this four sort of mantra that we've kind of been talking about, that sort of brings the audience to the table, but engages them, forces them to participate, and says, hey, you have a stake in this too.
Yep. So we have on the last slide just some resources that you can click through in the deck. Obviously, there's a good list of best social media tools by Forbes that you can either use or just take a look at. You don't need to necessarily download them all today. Some of them can be very intimidating, especially if you only have one handle and one channel. Social Media Today is a great news resource for all these trends that we've been talking about. If you have like a news aggregator or want to subscribe to the email newsletter, something to passively kind of just scroll through and look at, it's great. And if you want to look at inspiration of what really large companies are doing with social media, the Webbies are essentially the Emmys for digital social media campaigns. So take a look at that and you can see what some players like Nat Geo or even I think Kaiser Permanente had a campaign one year that was really great too, or was doing. So. And I think that's about it. Lisa, we're going to take some more questions.
Yep, we will. Thank you. So we have gotten a few questions in. So the next question that came in is, my program uses Facebook and Instagram currently. How can we start incorporating Snapchat as a way to let youth 13 to 24 know that our program does free HIV testing? So we actually have a podcast available that we're going to be chatting out the link right now on how a community engagement specialist, her name is Karen Merkfelt at Planned Parenthood of the Pacific Southwest, engaged youth using Snapchat. And she goes through, it's a really informative podcast. I really encourage you all who are interested in using Snapchat to listen to it, because she goes through a whole plan of how she developed the campaign and in a way to engage youth and how she implemented it, and I think it'll be really helpful. But overall, I think going back to some of the points that Chris and Michael and we've been making along the way is really in terms of using Snapchat to let youth know that your program does free HIV testing, is really thinking about it from their perspective in terms of what's in it for the youth and how to position that messaging to be appealing to them. I don't know, Michael or Chris, if you have anything else to add.
Nope.
Okay.
Yeah, content is king on Snapchat, so make sure that you have content and you have a sort of sense of what that content is going to look like, to Liesel's point, making sure that you know specifically what that audience needs and how that audience would like to have it, because Snapchat is very sort of ephemeral and disappears and is a tricky sort of surface, but it can be done. But yeah, I think I've heard this podcast, it's really, really great, and I think there are really great ideas there.
Awesome, yeah, and I would add that she also goes over planning, how important it is to plan the content ahead of time so that you have it all ready to go. The next question was how much budget should we set aside for hiring celebrities or influencers, and I think that can really, really range. I mean,
yeah, I think a good go-to is taking a look at the follower base and looking at the number of people that are following them and who they are. And I don't have an exact formula for you to assess this with, but if you wanted to go back into how much money it would take you to reach that audience inside of Facebook or inside Twitter yourself, that might be a good benchmark to start with. Obviously using an ad planning campaign is a way to get at that. More often than not, if the people do this already, they have a rate. I think it's up to you to determine whether that is worth it for you, and again, making sure that you've checked all the boxes. They're not just showing off your product, they're showing off your product, asking people to participate, and giving them a follow-up action to do, so that you can make it worth your while.
Great, thanks. And then we've gotten a couple of requests for the slides, and we will be distributing them after today's webinar. That will be sent to you within about a week of today, and we'll include links that we've mentioned and included in the chat today, as well as a link to download the slides and access the recording of today's webinar so you can go back and listen to it. I know we've packed in a lot of information, and so for those of you who are crawling, it may feel a bit overwhelming, but like I said, you just need to keep moving forward and taking one step at a time, and to expand your social media strategy. So hang on just one moment. We're getting a few more questions in, and we'll see if we can handle those. So there was one question that came in about funding sources to look into that could assist with advertising for campaigns on Facebook, and we will look into this a little bit more. Facebook used to grant, to have a small ad grants, but this was back in like 2015, 2016. So there are those types of opportunities. You could also look into Google Ads as an option. Those, again, with Google or Facebook or any of these ad campaigns, you can set your budget very low, and you'll be surprised how much you can get even for $10 a day. But I know in small nonprofits, your budgets are tight. So we will try to follow up in the posted Q&A with additional ideas. Michael and Chris, do you have any?
No, I think you kind of hit on something that might be helpful from a perspective. When you're looking at doing an activity like this, it might be just looking at suspending another activity to try this one. So instead of, again, I'm going to hate on flyers for a half second. Instead of printing out flyers to put up on telephone poles, spend the $10, you would do that on a Facebook campaign for a week or so and see what happens. If you actually get a click-through and then like an appointment after that, that might be more valuable than the intake that you're getting from the street, if that's the case.
So then one of the last questions we got was what social media platform works with family planning messages for reproductive age women and men, so 13 to 50. So it's really specific, and one thing I would encourage you to do is, in order to figure out what platform to use, is to do some social listening. And again, we can distribute some resources after the webinar in regards to this. But basically, social listening is going to the different platforms and trying to find out where your audience is. So you go and watch the conversation on Twitter and on Facebook and other platforms to see where the people that you're trying to reach, see where the conversations are happening, and then determine which platform to use based on that social listening. And there's a resource from hiv.gov that we can distribute about this that should be helpful in terms of helping you to make that choice about platform. But ultimately, you don't, in terms of choosing the platform, before choosing the platform, you really want to define your audience and what your objectives are so that you know those, and that helps to inform which platform you choose. I think often, the knee-jerk reaction is to go and choose the platform first, and that's not always the most effective way to build your campaign in terms of factoring in who your audience is and what objectives and goals you're trying to meet.
Yep. I have a quick aside to that. I agree with Liesl 110,000%, and I also want to add that this audience seems a little heavy, so what you want to also do, I think we talked a little bit earlier about it, is unpack your audiences. You're not going to necessarily talk to 13-year-olds the way you talk to 50-year-olds, the way you talk to women, the way you talk to men, across family sets. So you want to think about what this audience might look like in 4 or 5 different demographics. So think about breaking your audiences up too, because it might be that you need to talk to one audience on one platform, 13 to 24 women, and men 45 to 50 on an entirely different platform. So also think about that as well. The audience doesn't have to be so huge. That's a really good thing. You have the opportunity to really break them down and define them, and as Lisa said, find the best platform for your message.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, we have one last question before I think we need to end. So the question is, aside from the already mentioned forums, where else can we create quizzes for free? So we did them on Google Form, using the Google Form and SurveyMonkey. There is also a quiz option, I believe, through Facebook. Believe through the Facebook ad development, you can create a quiz. Is that right, Michael?
That's correct. Yep.
Yep. And then are there any other ones that come to mind immediately for doing free quizzes?
Yeah, Typeform is another one that works really well. It has a fairly robust set of functionality for a free account.
Okay. Great. Well, we are right at 3:30, so I don't want to keep anyone over the hour. So thank you so much today for joining us, and we hope that we're able to give you some ideas and strategies for you to use at your organizations in developing your social media strategies. And I want to thank Michael and Chris for all of your input and expertise that you shared today. We definitely could not have done our quiz campaign without you all. And for all those who attended, if you could complete the webinar evaluation, we will chat out the link to you and also pop up when you close today's WebEx. You can sign up for our mailing list at whatworksinYouthHIV.org. Follow us on Twitter at whatworksythhiv, and you can always contact us via email, whatworksinYouthHIV@jsi.com. So thank you again so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.
All right, bye everybody.